Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome back to Jane Austen July. Today I'm going to be talking about my favourite Jane Austen characters. So, I have a list here for you of my favourite Jane Austen characters. It is a list from 11 to 1, but there are 14 characters because there are 3 that I want to talk about together because I love them for the same reasons, if that makes sense. It was very hard to pick this list because I love so many of Jane Austen characters, but these are a few of my favourites. Now, this video is going to be relatively spoilery, so I would advise you to leave and not watch this video unless you have read Pride and Prejudice, Sensibility, Emma, Suasion and Mansfield Park. You don't need to have read Northanger Abbey because none of my favourite characters apparently come from Northanger Abbey, and you don't need to have read Lady Susan because although I have one character from Lady Susan, that bit won't be spoilery, but the rest, spoilers about. I have one character whose very existence is a spoiler, but yes, okay, let's get into the characters. At number 11 I have Mary Crawford from Mansfield Park. She was a late addition. I wrote this list earlier on in the month, and then as I have been listening to Mansfield Park this month, I decided that Mary Crawford is such a good character I have to mention her. Mary Crawford is a very interesting character because although she is definitely not the heroine of Mansfield Park, and although she is set up in opposition to Fanny, who is the heroine of Mansfield Park, at times Mary Crawford feels much closer to characters like Elizabeth Bennet and Emma Woodhouse than someone like Fanny does, and in some ways she is a more immediately compelling character. Certainly the first time I read Mansfield Park, I think I preferred Mary Crawford to Fanny, although we'll talk about Fanny later on in this video because I love her very much too. Mary Crawford is a very interesting character, and I think you see in her a kind of division of good and bad qualities, I suppose, in that she is good and kind sometimes, and she does love deeply, but also she has particular expectations, and you see the kind of influence and the mix of her personality and her education. She's very, very psychologically complex, and I find that really interesting. And interesting too that unlike a lot of the heroines of Jane Austen's other books that she in some ways resembles, she doesn't kind of go through the same sort of moral transformations. I feel like I could spend a long time talking about all of these characters, so I'll try and be brief and I will move on to the next one. At number 10 I have John Willoughby from Sense and Sensibility. Yes, I know, he's not a very likeable character, but this list is of the characters I think Jane Austen has drawn the best rather than like the ones I want to invite to a dinner party. Don't really want to meet John Willoughby, but what a brilliantly drawn character. One of the reasons why I really like Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility is one, because I think the Marianne Willoughby plotline is the best part of Sense and Sensibility for me, but also because I think he's really well and psychologically complexly drawn. Jane Austen has a lot of rakish characters in her books, but if you compare Willoughby to someone like Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice or Mr. Elliot in Persuasion, Willoughby is by far the most realised and complicated of the rakish characters, potentially except one who I'll talk about a bit later, but I think he is done very, very well because he's not just 2D evil, he does love Marianne deeply, and he's someone who's made a lot of mistakes. Dubious mistakes, of course, quite bad mistakes. He's not a very nice man. But also you do see some better parts of him. In my opinion, the single best scene in Sense and Sensibility is the scene where Willoughby comes to try and see Marianne when he hears that she's incredibly ill and talks to Eleanor and tries to explain himself, because it is really sad. Yes, he's not a good man, but you can feel sorry for him and you can to a certain extent understand him, and I think that's really powerfully and well done. Jane Austen, writing in the early 19th century, has the ability to make a rake to a certain degree sympathetic. Like, that's impressive, right? From one of the rakes to one of the heroes, my number 9 character is Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, who is obviously a very, very likeable character. One of the things I like about Mr. Darcy is that he is not actually that super likeable at first, and also that he is by no means perfect, although he has a reputation for being the perfect man. He's very awkward and rude, and he is proud, and he's always proud. Even when he's kind of gone through changes of sentiments, he still does have certain pride, which I think is okay, and that's part of the point. I think he's a really interesting character partly because of his character trajectory and his character arc, and the way he changes and the way that him and Elizabeth change each other. It's one of the things I love about Pride and Prejudice, but I also enjoy his social awkwardness in the earlier chapters, and like how you see a mix of pride and a mix of the kind of shyness almost that his sister has, but displayed in a different way. He's a really interesting character, and yeah, one I'd certainly like. At number 8 is Anne Elliot from Persuasion, who I really, really love. I think she's a very interesting and admirable character. I love how sensible she is, and also that she has gone on a really long journey of self-discovery over the last 8 years, and although we don't get to see the character development quite as much in this single book, we do get to see how it has happened over the last 8 years and how she has gone from being someone who is persuadable to someone who knows her own mind a little bit more. She's also incredibly sensible and practical, which is something I really, really admire about her. Yes, she is quiet, but unlike some other quiet characters you get in 19th century literature, or for example Fanny, but not to slight Fanny because I love Fanny Price very, very much, but Fanny is physically weak, whereas Anne is shown to be very, very capable. When Louisa Musgrove has her fall, Anne is immediately the first person to suggest action, suggest what they will do, and Captain Wentworth suggests that she ought to stay with Louisa Musgrove as the most capable person. And I really like that Anne, while being quiet and kind of stepping back from things, is also one of the most capable and clever people that is in the book, and she's great. And yes, right, next character. At number 7, I have Mr. Collins from Pride and Prejudice. Again, not a man I would want to have dinner with, but so brilliantly drawn. Now, Mr. Collins is one of those characters in Jane Austen who is potentially slightly less realistic, but one of the things I like that Jane Austen does with her more minor characters, something Dickens also does, which I love in both of them, is she takes kind of realistic characterizations and pushes them a little bit so they're a bit exaggerated. Mr. Collins is an exaggeration, but also then and now we've met people with a little bit of Mr. Collins in. He's also absolutely hilarious to read about, except for the times when he's also really not hilarious, because he's also really quite horrible, especially in his reaction to Lydia's elopement with Wickham. Like, Mr. Collins is not a very nice man. He is absolutely hilariously and brilliantly drawn. His proposal scene to Elizabeth is one of the funniest and most, like, awkward scenes in Jane Austen, but he's also a complicated figure too, and he's also exaggerated but to make a particular point. So yes, very interesting character. Moving on to the next one. At number 6 I have my trio of characters, and the 3 I want to talk about here are Mrs. Elton from Emma, Caroline Bingley from Pride and Prejudice, and Fanny Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility. These 3 characters are some of the bitchiest characters in Jane Austen. There is no other word. I'm sorry, I don't like to swear on my channel, but that's the appropriate word here. I think they're brilliantly done and hilarious, but also awful, but also believable, because you also encounter people like that. Again, like Mr. Collins, perhaps exaggerated to a certain extent, or at least with Fanny Dashwood and Mrs. Elton, perhaps not so much with Caroline Bingley. But they are also believable, and they're also really powerfully done characters, both appalling to read about, but also hilarious at times for the kind of things they say. 3 characters whose malice and selfishness I absolutely adore. At number 5 we have Mr. Knightley from Emma. Mr. Knightley is probably my favourite Jane Austen hero, although Emma is by no means my favourite Jane Austen book. But Mr. Knightley is what I think is best about this book in some ways. Emma frustrates me a little bit, but I think Mr. Knightley is a really great character, and I do think their relationship is developed really well, and his kind of views on her and her character development and how that links into his personality and his friendship is really, really interesting. And I like their dynamic and their relationship, and I think he's a great, great character. I really need to reread Emma actually, because it's been a little while since I last read it, and it's certainly one that I enjoy, and Mr. Knightley is such a brilliantly drawn character. At number 4 we have Lady Susan from Lady Susan. Lady Susan potentially falls into a kind of similar category to Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Elton and Fanny Dashwood, but she's also something a little bit more than that, partly because she is the main character and we get a closer look inside her head. I love that through the letters in Lady Susan we get to see Lady Susan in all her different facets and how she can appear to so many different people. Her daughter is terrified of her, Reginald de Courcy is immediately besotted with her, her best friend knows how plotting and scheming and selfish she is, and various other people don't know quite what to make of her. Her sister-in-law doesn't like her but can't always prove to other people quite why she doesn't like her. Lady Susan is a fascinating character. She is malicious, she is two-faced, she is very, very selfish. She's also hilarious to read about, and she's also ruthless and fascinating. So yes, if you haven't read Lady Susan, you definitely should. And in second and third place, I have my 2 favourite heroines from Jane Austen novels, and I'm not really sure which of these goes above, but I'm gonna say that at number 3 is Fanny Price from Mansfield Park, who I think is a wonderful character. I know a lot of people think her boring, but personally I think she's fascinating. One, because unlike many other Jane Austen characters, she doesn't go on a journey of like self-development. She doesn't have a kind of character development arc, exactly, because she's kind of already formed and knows her own principles and knows her own mind and is the cleverest person in Mansfield Park by a long way, no matter what many other people may think. She's usually the one that knows what's going on when no one else does, and who understands the people around her much better than they understand each other. She's quiet, she's awkward, she's easily embarrassed, she's painfully shy, but underneath her meek exterior, she's also really, really emotionally strong, and she knows her principles and she knows her feelings and she knows her heart very, very well. And that's wonderful, because actually often in 19th century literature when you get a character who on the surface is kind of meek and who is physically weak, they don't know their own mind as well as Fanny does, but actually Fanny kind of has it together in a way that a lot of people don't, and I think Fanny is great. I love Mansell Park a lot, and Fanny Price is definitely one of the reasons why I love it. But at number 2, my favourite Jane Austen heroine is probably just about, possibly tied with Fanny Price, Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. I love Pride and Prejudice, it is my favourite Jane Austen novel, and one of the reasons why it is my favourite is because Elizabeth Bennet is a really compelling heroine. She doesn't get everything right, she makes mistakes, she misjudges people, she is incredibly prejudiced and proud, but also she is funny, she is hilarious, her wit is great, she is entertaining, she is kinder than her younger sisters, though not perhaps as kind as her elder sister, and she's really, really psychologically complex. You get such a strong look into her head in Pride and Prejudice, and you get to follow the development and change of her feelings, and although she does make mistakes, she's also willing to learn and willing to find herself wrong, and she's such a brilliant, engaging character to read about, and I find her very funny, as I said. The wit of Elizabeth Bennet is definitely something to admire. At number 1, my favourite character in Jane Austen, a very controversial choice, I'm going to say Henry Crawford from Mansfield Park to just top and tail this list with the Crawford siblings. I think Henry Crawford is a fascinating and brilliant character, and I really, really like him. I mentioned earlier when talking about Willoughby, about the kind of rakish characters within Jane Austen. I mentioned how Mr. Wickham and Mr. Elliot are not that well developed, how Willoughby is more developed, but I think Henry Crawford is the most psychologically complex of characters who kind of occupy that position, except that he doesn't exactly occupy that position. Mariah Bertram, who Henry Crawford runs away with at the end of the book, is not presented by any means as a victim as much as, for example, the girl Willoughby seduces in Sensibility, or Lydia Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Obviously Lydia, like, also instigates the elopement, but she's so young and we definitely get the impression that she expected them to be married at once and kind of doesn't know what she's doing is wrong, really. Whereas in Mansell Park, Mariah Bertram behaves as wrongly, if not more wrongly, than Henry Crawford does. And Henry Crawford is weirdly likeable, at least for me, and I think one of the reasons why I find Henry Crawford a very likeable character is that he is the first person to see Fanny Price's worth at all. Like, one of the things I have said about Mansell Park before is I love Mansell Park a lot, but I don't love it for the love story. I don't really like Edmund Bertram. I think he takes Fanny Price for granted a lot, and I even think at the end he doesn't really see her true worth, and I think Henry Crawford is the first person who sees the true worth of Fanny Price and intends to kind of trifle with her and then realises that she's incredible and falls in love with her, and I think that's fascinating. And I do think, like, Mansell Park's a very interesting book, but I do think there is a point in Mansell Park where if Fanny Price was not in love with Edmund, she might fall in love with Henry Crawford and he would be a much better man for it, but she wouldn't, and that's the point, and she knows her own heart and she knows her own mind, and that's why she doesn't marry him. But you can also see a better side of Henry Crawford that could have been brought forth. I think Crawford is an incredibly psychologically complex character because you do see the wrong in him, and you see the want of principles, and you see the lack of consistency, and you see the way he gives in easily to temptation, but you also see an appreciation of intelligence and kindness in Fanny, and you also see an endeavouring to be better than he knows he is at times, which I find really interesting. I think he's a brilliant, fascinating character. One of the reasons why Mansell Park is my favourite book, aside from the fact that I love Fanny Price a lot, I also think the Crawford siblings are fascinating characters. So there we have it, those are my favourite characters in Jane Austen. Let me know down in the comments who your favourite characters are in Jane Austen, both in terms of the characters you like the most and the characters you appreciate their existence the most, because a lot of these characters are not that likeable, but one of the things I love about Jane Austen is her dislikable characters because she writes them so brilliantly. So yes, that is all for this time, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.